We're here on a special occasion. We're here on the first holy day of the days of Unleavened Bread. The spring festivals have as their focus the themes of redemption and deliverance. Redemption and deliverance. Put another way, you could say that life and liberty represent the twin themes of this season of the year. We were redeemed. Jesus Christ was our Passover, just as was heard in the song. Jesus Christ, our Passover, was sacrificed for us. And that makes possible our redemption. Makes possible our having life. You know, God told ancient Israel, as He prepared to bring about the events that culminated in the Passover, God had a plan. He was going to pass through the land, and He was going to allow the death angel to smite the firstborn throughout the land of Egypt. And yet, there were those who would be spared, those who were under the blood of the Lamb, those who had that blood on their doorpost were to be spared. They were to be passed over. And it was to be kept that as a memorial from year to year, as a reminder of what God had done, of God's redemption of His people. But God didn't redeem His people so that they could remain in Egypt as slaves. The purpose of redemption was not to remain where they were. Rather, the purpose of redemption was to allow for deliverance. Deliverance from Egypt. Deliverance from bondage. Deliverance from servitude. Jesus Christ came talking about redemption and deliverance. In John chapter 8. John chapter 8 in verse 30, Jesus spoke these words. As He spoke these words, many believed on Him. Then said Jesus to those Jews which believed on Him, if you continue in my word, then are you my disciples indeed. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. They answered and said, we're Abraham's seed. We were never in bondage to any man. How do you say you shall be made free? And Jesus answered them, truly I say unto you, whosoever commits sin is the servant of sin. And the servant abides not in the house forever, but the Son abides forever. If the Son therefore shall make you free, you shall be free indeed. The servant doesn't abide in the house forever. The servant has no claim on the property. The servant has no intrinsic right to remain there. It doesn't belong to him. He is there as long as the master is pleased to have him there. But he has no claim on the property. The son, however, is an heir. He has a claim on the property and ultimately will inherit the property. Jesus said, whosoever commits sin is the servant of sin. Sin produces bondage. Sin produces servitude. Now, the servant doesn't abide. The servant does not continue and have some guarantee of continuance, but rather the son does. The servant doesn't. The son does. If the Son, Jesus Christ, shall make you free, you shall be free indeed. Our deliverance comes not from what you and I are able to do for ourselves. It comes from what God is able to do for us through Jesus Christ. Because that's where deliverance comes from. Ancient Israel was not in a position to deliver themselves from slavery. You know, we're told back in the Exodus account that they cried unto God by reason of their bondage. They were very overwhelmed. And they cried out for deliverance. You know, it's amazing how there is sort of a sense of an illusion of self-sufficiency when everything's going along okay. When you think you've got it all under control, it's easy to sort of cruise along and have an illusion of self-sufficiency. But you know, let the bottom fall out. Let all the problems, let all these things. And very quickly, we become aware of our need for something beyond ourselves. Now, it's interesting because with many people, that's pretty short-lived. You know, in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, there was a great upsurge in this country. There was an upsurge in terms of religion. It was interesting, you know, there are various polls and various surveys showed that a lot of people all of a sudden started attending church. Response to the telecast, and I'm sure not only our telecast, but response to things like that went up. People got scared. They were afraid their whole world was about to collapse around them. But you know what happened? Of course, as a few weeks went by, and the weeks turned into months, and nothing drastic happened. The tendency of human beings is to drop right back into that sort of lull and to assume, oh, okay, no need to wake up. I can turn over and go back to sleep. That was, the end is not yet. That's, Christ talked about the midnight hour. There are a lot of people who like to set their clock about 5 minutes to midnight. Wake up, rub the sleep out of their eyes, and be all ready to hop out of bed by the time the midnight hour arrives. But they really don't want to be up and doing very much before then. Well, that is not a real workable program. Jesus Christ talked about deliverance from bondage, and that theme is addressed in other portions of the Scripture. Paul addresses it in the book of Romans when he talked about in Romans chapter 6 and verse 12, "Let not sin therefore reign in your mortal body, that you should obey it in the lust thereof." Let not sin reign. That means sin is not to be the ruling, controlling factor. Neither yield you your members as instruments of unrighteousness unto sin, but yield yourselves unto God as those that are alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness unto God. For sin shall not have dominion, lordship, rulership over you, for you are not under the law, under that penalty any longer, rather under grace. The law exacts a penalty when it is broken. The transgression of the law is sin, we're told in 1 John 3:4. The wages of sin is death. To be under the law in this context refers to being under the penalty that the law exacts. But God offers us a gift. You know, your wages are what you earn. God offers us a gift, something that we did not earn. But we're told, don't you know that to whom you yield yourselves servants to obey, his servants you are. His servants you are, to whom you obey, whether of sin unto death or of obedience unto righteousness. You were the servants of sin, but you have obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine that was delivered from you. Being made free from sin, you became the servants of righteousness. Ancient Israel was brought out of Egypt, delivered from being the servants of Pharaoh, to have the opportunity of becoming the servants of God. No longer the servants of Pharaoh, but the servants of God. They were brought, they were redeemed, they were bought, they were purchased, and they belonged to God. They were redeemed so that they might be delivered. You and I were redeemed as we celebrated at the occasion of the Passover, so that we might be delivered. And that's what we're here to focus on and to put our attention on here today, and what we're here to celebrate. Now, I want to ask you two questions in context of our deliverance. What is it that brings us into captivity to sin in the first place? What is it that ensnares and entangles us? People don't set out as their career goal, I want to be a slave. That's my goal. I want to work my way into being a slave of someone. Now, you may feel like there are times some people with their job circumstance may feel like that at least from the boss's perspective, they belong to him. But that's not usually what people want. That's not what we desire. Slaves traditionally were made so. They were captives in war. They were people who were in some way deprived of their liberty. Sometimes it was as a result of warfare. Sometimes it was a punishment for crime. But they were deprived of liberty. What is it that brings us into captivity to sin? I don't know very many people, certainly, that sit down and have as their goal, I would like to be a slave to my passions. My desire, my goal in life is I want to be a slave to drugs and alcohol. I want to be a slave to ambition and passion and have it just rule and wreck my life. That's my goal. People don't set out to be ensnared and captured. You see, somehow we think it seems that what happens to us or what happens to others will happen to us. My first question for you is, what is it exactly that brings us into captivity to sin? What is it that ensnares and enslaves us? And secondly, the second question is, how can you be an overcomer? Christ talked about overcoming. He said, to him that overcomes will I grant to sit with me in my throne, even as I also overcame and am set down with my Father in his throne. How can you be an overcomer? How can we become overcomers and make our journey successful, our journey out of spiritual Egypt? God redeemed Israel and He delivered them. But they had their part to play. What was their part? Their part was to follow where God led. He led them with a pillar of fire by night and a cloud by day. Their responsibility was to put one foot in front of the other and to follow where He led. And if they stuck with God, if they followed where He led, they would eventually cross the Red Sea and be out of Egypt. Because God was bringing them to the mountain of God, to Horeb, or Sinai, as it's also called. Bringing them to the mountain of God to enter into a covenant relationship with Him. And that in turn was to set the stage for their entering in and inheriting the promised land. The land that God had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the land of milk and honey. They would go from heirs to inheritors. They would go from being strangers and sojourners to entering into rest. Now, those things that Israel went through were types of the spiritual plan of God that starts with our redemption and deliverance from sin, from spiritual Egypt. Our entering into a covenant relationship with Him, becoming the people of God by a covenant that we make. And we're reminded at Pentecost of the covenant. God initially made the old covenant at Horeb, and then Christ came bringing the good news about a new covenant. The new covenant was to solve the problem that the people had. The problem with the old covenant wasn't God's problem, it was the people's problem. The people did not have a heart to obey. And so the new covenant had to do with how to change the heart. And then ultimately, you see, we enter into that covenant relationship so that ultimately we can enter into inheritance. That we can enter into glory. That we can inherit the promises that God has for us. What brings us into captivity, and how is it that we can become genuine overcomers and be able to follow Christ step by step out of our spiritual bondage. To begin with, let's look at some of the sources of sin. You know, often people look and say, well, I did that and I shouldn't have done it, and boy, I said this and I shouldn't have said that. Did the sin start when you reached out and took something that didn't belong to you? Did the sin start when you said words that you shouldn't have said? No. Those actions were the result of something that had started earlier in our mind. Now let's look at sources of sin, because it's these sources of sin that make us captive and slave. The first source that I want to look at is covetousness. Now, covetousness includes both lust and greed, because the commandment, thou shalt not covet, says you're not to covet your neighbor's property, and you're also not to covet your neighbor's wife. You're not to covet his house or his property. You're not to covet his wife. So covetousness includes both lust and greed. The two go hand in hand together. There are many examples of covetousness in the Scripture and the problems that it created for people. When you go back to the book of Joshua and the time that Israel entered into the land, we find, of course, the story of Jericho. Joshua chapter 6. Jericho being shut up, and specific instructions were given regarding Jericho. That is that the city of Jericho was totally dedicated to God. Everything there was to be reserved for God. The people were not allowed to take any booty, any treasure, anything. Nothing was to be touched, because it belonged to God. Well, in Joshua chapter 7, verse 1, we're told that the children of Israel committed a trespass in the accursed thing. For Achan, the son of Carmi, Achan, who was of the tribe of Judah, took of the accursed thing, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against the children of Israel. The next battle they went out to against the little city of Ai, they were roundly defeated. And it really took the heart out of them. People couldn't imagine why such a thing had happened. Well, Joshua went to God, and the story unfolds here in Joshua chapter 7 that the tribes were brought before God, and the tribe of Judah was selected, and then the families of the tribe of Judah, and the family that was selected, and we finally come all the way down to a man by the name of Achan, who was selected out. And Joshua said, Achan, verse 19, my son, give, I pray you, glory to the Lord God of Israel, and make confession unto him. Tell me what you've done. What did you do? Don't hide it. And Achan answered Joshua, and he said, well, I've sinned against the Lord God of Israel, and thus have I done. When I saw the spoils, a goodly Babylonish garment, and 200 shekels of silver, and a wedge of gold of 50 shekels weight, I coveted them, and I took them, and behold, they are hid in the earth in the midst of my tent, and the silver under it. Achan, as you come on down through the story, Achan and his family were destroyed. Achan and his family were destroyed. What was it that set Achan up for destruction? It was covetousness. You see, as we look at the sources of sin, as we look at the qualities that make us captives and slaves to sin, we start with covetousness. Achan was an example of one who coveted. He saw something, it wasn't his, but he wanted it. It looked good. Nobody will ever know. Boy, you talk about a statement that has proven incorrect. Time after time after time. You know, most of the time when people get ready to do something they shouldn't do, they think, nobody will ever find out. Well, you know, there are prisons who are full of people who thought nobody would ever find out. They're disgraced politicians turned out of office that thought nobody would ever find out. They're people whose lives have been shamed because they thought nobody would ever find out. Nobody would ever know. Achan thought he could get in there and take that. No one would ever know. Boy, here was this beautiful garment. Here was this. Here was that. Now you can go through the Bible and you can find example after example. Notice, let's go back to the book of Luke, chapter 16. Here's Jesus Christ talking. We'll pick it up in verse 10. Luke 16 and verse 10. Jesus said, "He that is faithful in that which is least is faithful also in much. He that is unjust in the least is unjust also in much." So there is a quality of faithfulness that God is after. There is a quality of faithfulness that's very important to God. And so here Christ is explaining about that and saying that we learn that quality of faithfulness in whatever small areas of our life we have right now in preparation. Now, Christ went on to say, if you have not been faithful in the unrighteous mammon, talking about money, who shall commit to your trust the true riches? Coming on down a little bit in verse 13, no servant can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he'll hold to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. The Pharisees also, who were covetous, heard all these things, and they derided him. And Jesus said unto them, you are they which justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts. That which is highly esteemed among men is an abomination in the sight of God. No man can serve two masters. You see, covetousness entraps and ensnares people in sin. Because lust and greed, whether it's sexual lust, whether it's lust for power, whether it's lust for money, doesn't matter. It's the same principle. Now it's interesting, the Apostle Paul in Colossians and in Ephesians identifies covetousness with idolatry. So you make a circle that includes all the 10 commandments, because the first commandment says you shall have no other gods before the true God. The last commandment, the 10th one, says you shall not covet. Paul said covetousness is idolatry. So ultimately covetousness results in placing our personal desires and appetites paramount in our life. In other words, the self comes before God. So covetousness is a source of idolatry. Covetousness leads into every sort of thing. Paul talked about it in writing to Timothy, and he explained to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 6. He said in 1 Timothy 6 verse 9, they that will be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is a root, as it should properly be, a root of all evil. Not just money being the root, but the love of money, which while some have coveted after, that's the point, while some have coveted after, they've erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. You see, that is the point, that ultimately covetousness has led people into error, and it has produced sorrow. It is a root of all evil. Because if you look at it, can you name me one sin that people have not committed because of covetousness? Because, in this context, of the love of money. People have sold out and betrayed their country. They've sold out and betrayed everything that was supposedly important to them because they coveted. Achan brought destruction not only on himself, but his wife and his children. Brought destruction on his whole family because he coveted. Remember the story of Elijah? or Elisha in this particular case, where the Naaman the Syrian came down from Damascus, came down to Elisha to be healed. He was a leper. And Elisha told him to go and wash in the Jordan River 7 times, and he'd be healed. Well, at first Naaman got mad. He got upset. Well, he wasn't going to do that. That was crazy. He had better rivers than that back where he came from. The issue wasn't how good the river was. The issue was, were you doing what God said? So he began to realize, well, yeah, that was right. So he went down, he was bathed in the river 7 times, and he came up, and it said his flesh came on him new like a little child. I mean, it didn't just the leprosy disappear. I mean, this was better than any age cream that anybody ever marketed. Boy, you know, it was... Oh, not only did the leprosy disappear, the wrinkles disappeared too, see. He said his skin was fresh like a little child. Boy, he was excited. Came back to Elisha, and he wanted to give Elisha all this money and all these things. And Elisha said, no, you know, he said, that's not for sale. What I've given you, what God has given you, that's not for sale. I don't want your money. Elisha had a servant who was standing there, a man by the name of Gehazi. Now, Gehazi had been with Elisha for years. You can go through and read the account, different things. Gehazi had seen all sorts of miracles. He had heard the truth of God straight from the mouth of Elisha. But you know, Gehazi looked. He saw those beautiful garments. He saw the silver. He saw the gold. He said, I can't believe he's going to let him take all that stuff back to Damascus. He doesn't want any. I think I do. So, you know the story. See, Gehazi then, because he coveted, that was the first mistake. Then he lied. He went chasing after Elisha, got up there, after Naaman, caught him, and said, Naaman saw him coming and stopped, and what is it? And he said, you know, just after you left, a couple of guys showed up, and boy, Elisha wanted to be able to give them something. He didn't have anything. You know, if I could just get some of what you offered, I'd take it back. See, Gehazi thought, nobody will ever know. I'm not going to take the whole thing. I'm not totally greedy. I don't want it all, but I want some of it. See, we start dividing up our covetousness. Well, I'm not really covetous, because if I was covetous, I'd want it all. I just want a little of it. Well, you know, he came showing up back. He hid it there in some place right there around the house. Nobody will ever know. Walked into Elisha, and Elisha said, Gehazi, where you been? Oh, just sort of wandering around, just nowhere. And Elisha said, don't tell me that. I know exactly where you were. Boy, your eyes got big when you saw all that gold and all that stuff. You went chasing down there. You coveted, didn't you? The leprosy of Naaman is going to be on you. A horrible end, a horrible result. You see, there is virtually nothing. That's why it's called a root of all evil. Covetousness leads into every sort of compromise and betrayal of every sort of trust that's imaginable. When you are craving something that isn't yours, that it's not lawfully what ought to be yours, that appetite will lead you into a betrayal of everything imaginable if you follow that appetite. Covetousness, which exalts the appetites of self above exalts the appetites of self above God. You see, I think one of the things that has to be faced in terms of addiction, the spiritual core of addiction is idolatry. Because something comes before God. And that craving leads into incredible things. Covetousness is only one root, one source of sin. Ultimately, there is another source that in some ways could be called the fountainhead of all sin. And that source of sin is pride. If you want to know what was the original sin, the original sin was pride. You know, the Bible has an awful lot to say about pride. But when you read the account in Isaiah 14 and in Ezekiel 28, they talk about Lucifer. Talk about this great covering cherub that was so beautiful and so wise and had so much ability. What do we find? That his heart was lifted up because of his beauty. His heart was lifted up. He said, I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will be like the Most High. Pride. He was lifted up. He was exalted in his own opinion of himself. Now, pride has set up a lot of people for a lot of problems. Let's just notice a couple of scriptures in Proverbs very briefly. Back in Proverbs chapter 13. Proverbs chapter 13 and verse 10, it says, only by pride comes contention. Only by pride comes contention. So pride leads to strife. It leads to all sorts of difficulty and argument and strife. Come on forward. Proverbs 16. Proverbs 16 verse 18 says, pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. Verse 5 of Proverbs 16 tells us that everyone that is proud of heart is an abomination to the Lord. God hates pride. Why does He hate pride? Because of what pride leads to. Pride separates us from God. Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. You remember the story of Nebuchadnezzar that's recounted in Daniel chapter 4? Nebuchadnezzar had this dream. And ultimately Daniel was called in to explain the dream. And what Daniel told him was really a horrible and frightening thing. Daniel said, you are going to lose your sanity. You are going to be driven from men. You're going to be like a wild animal. That you may know that the Most High rules in the affairs of men and sets over nations whomsoever He will. Nebuchadnezzar was the great conqueror. Nebuchadnezzar put together this great empire. He called himself a king of kings. Nebuchadnezzar was a great ruler. Well, Nebuchadnezzar, when he heard the interpretation from Daniel, it scared him. And Daniel gave him some advice. He said, you know, king, if you'll break off your sins by reason of righteousness and by showing mercy to the poor, if you'll start being kind and helpful and considerate to others, to quit doing the things you're doing, God will have mercy and things will be postponed. Well, I'll tell you what, I bet the first day or two you couldn't have met a nicer fellow than old Nebuchadnezzar. He was saying please and thank you all over the place. He was just a nice guy, boy. People were probably in shock around the palace, you know. Nebuchadnezzar never acted like that before. He was a haughty, arrogant sort of fellow. But it scared him. Because he had this vivid dream. He had seen this thing. Daniel explained it to him. He had a lot of confidence in Daniel. But you know, Nebuchadnezzar's dream was a little bit like 9/11. Nebuchadnezzar had the fear thrown into him, and he was very careful. But the days went by and nothing happened. A week went by and nothing happened. Maybe Nebuchadnezzar had a little slip here and there, and he wasn't, didn't do a perfect job, and lightning didn't strike. A few weeks went by, and boy, he was walking a little straighter and standing a little taller, and the months went by. And one day, 12 months later, he was strutting around the palace, looking out. Is not this great Babylon that I have built for my glory? Boom. The voice from heaven. This day, your kingdom is taken away from you. Nebuchadnezzar went crazy, insane. He was driven forth from the palace, and for 7 years he roamed the fields and the forests like a wild animal. Coming out at night, It talks about his hair growing long. Where do you think the legends of the werewolf and things like that came? Nebuchadnezzar, wild animals come out at night, don't they? They're not around. You don't generally see them in the daytime. Nebuchadnezzar was out howling at the moon right along with the wolf pack. And by the time these years went by, he looked like one. He was roaming the woods, roaming the forests and the fields, living like an animal for 7 years. And at the end of 7 years, his sanity returned. And we're told Nebuchadnezzar was a changed fellow. He said, now I extol and honor and exalt the God of heaven. And he said, all that walk in pride, he is able to abase. Nebuchadnezzar realized at that point that there was someone a lot greater than he was. Pride is destructive. You read so many of the kings of Judah, even some of the righteous kings. You read about Uzziah, who was a man that started out as a good king. But then we're told that because of his success, because of what he had accomplished, his heart was lifted up by pride. Pride is a fountainhead of sin. That's where it all started with Lucifer. Pride is a roadblock to repentance. Pride is a roadblock to change and growth. We could comb the Bible and look at all of the things that pride produces. Pride stands in the way of saying, I'm sorry. Pride stands in the way of admitting that we're wrong. Pride comes in and separates friends. It sometimes prevents reconciliation between husbands and wives, between friends. Because pride gets in the way. Our pride is wounded. Somebody said something. Somebody did something. Why are we so upset? Well, pride often has a little bit to do with it. In fact, pride generally has a lot to do with it. Covetousness and pride are both sources of sin that make us captives and slaves. There's another source of sin, and that is the hurt that produces resentment and bitterness. There's an interesting account. We read the story back in 2 Samuel. In fact, there are two stories, two very tragic stories that brought about destruction that are both tied in to hurt. The story starts, of course, with lust and covetousness, and that is when one of David's sons, Amnon, lusted for his sister, or half-sister, Tamar. Amnon convinced himself that he just had to have Tamar. Amnon was a prince. He could have married any number of women, but he had his eyes set on one that could not lawfully be his. And he tried first to entice Tamar, and then when he couldn't entice her, he forced her. Well, in the aftermath of that, Amnon, we're told, hated her exceedingly in the aftermath of having raped her. Tamar was humiliated. She felt degraded. She just was overwhelmed at what had happened. And her brother, Absalom was very angry. Now, King David was very angry, but he didn't really do anything about it. Absalom was angry. Absalom was deeply hurt at what had happened. Absalom, we're told, simply didn't speak to his brother. He hated him because of what he had done. 2 years went by. Absalom didn't speak a word to Amnon. He nursed that grudge. He was so eaten up with the hurt and the resentment and the bitterness about what had happened. 2 years went by. Nothing had been said. Amnon sort of thought everything had settled out. It hadn't settled out. Absalom got all his brothers together for a big barbecue down where at his ranch, where he'd had a big sheep shearing. Got them all down there for the purpose of killing Amnon. He murdered him. And then, of course, he had to flee because he was afraid of getting in trouble. So he took off and went to his grandfather's outside the borders of Israel, his mother's father. And he stayed there for a period of several years. Eventually, by Joab's intervention, Absalom was brought back. But there was still so much hurt. David was so hurt about what had happened, what Absalom had done, that he couldn't bring himself to really reconcile with Absalom. So even after Absalom came back to Jerusalem, he and the king didn't see each other. Time went by. In fact, he was back in Jerusalem for 2 whole years. Didn't even see his father. Well, eventually, Joab sought to reconcile the two of them, but by this time, Absalom had nursed his hurt so long. There was no reconciliation. You go on through the story, and ultimately, the rebellion that Absalom launched stemmed from the hurt that festered into resentment and bitterness that he could never turn loose of. Now, if you come on through the story, we find in 2 Samuel 15:12 that Absalom sent for Ahithophel. Ahithophel the Gilonite, David's counselor. And somebody told David, 2 Samuel 15:31, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. Now, Ahithophel was a very wise, very capable individual. We're told that Ahithophel, tells us in 2 Samuel 16:23, the counsel of Ahithophel, which he counseled in those days, was if a man had inquired at the oracle of God. So it was all the counsel of Ahithophel, both to David and Absalom. Ahithophel was such a wise, perceptive individual that it was to ask his advice was almost like you could go to God himself. Because Ahithophel just always managed to see right through, to put things together. Extremely capable man. He was David's counselor. He was David's friend. He was the man that David trusted. And yet Ahithophel cast his lot in with Absalom and did his best to destroy David. Why did Ahithophel go from being David's trusted counselor and friend to being one who betrayed him and was doing his best to bring about his death? Well, let me show you a couple of things. And I think that the Bible doesn't just come right out and say in one specific verse what embittered Ahithophel so deeply, but it does give us the information that we can put the story together. In 2 Samuel chapter 23, 2 Samuel 23, it tells us in verse 8, these are the mighty men whom David had. And it goes on down through this list of mighty men. And when you get down to verse 34, the last part of verse 34, it mentions Eliam, the son of Ahithophel the Gileonite. Now we read that Ahithophel the Gileonite was one of David's most trusted advisors. He was a man who was amazingly wise and perceptive. Here we learn that Ahithophel's son, Eliam, was one of David's mighty men. He was a valiant soldier, one of David's mighty men. Now, with that in mind, let's go back to 2 Samuel 11. This is the account of Bathsheba, David and Bathsheba. David, of course, 2 Samuel 11:2, was walking on the roof of his house and he saw a woman, a very beautiful woman, bathing on the roof of her house. David sent, we're told in 2 Samuel 11:3, and inquired after the woman, who is that? And he was told, this is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, therefore the granddaughter of Ahithophel. I think when you put it together, it's very apparent as to the source of Ahithophel's hatred and resentment and bitterness toward David. Ahithophel could never forgive David for what happened. It's interesting in Psalm 55, a scripture that Christ quoted in the New Testament that was quoted in the New Testament referring to Jesus Christ, or referring to Judas Iscariot in his betrayal of Jesus Christ. 5:12. David writes, "It was not an enemy that reproached me, then I could have borne it. Neither was it he that hated me that did magnify himself against me, then I would have hid myself from him. But it was you, a man, my equal, my guide, my acquaintance. We took sweet counsel together. We walked unto the house of God in company." It was the man I trusted. You know, mine own familiar friend, the one that ate bread with me, lifted up his hand. Christ quoted that part when he referred it to Judas. It wasn't an enemy. It was a friend. It was my guide, my acquaintance. Ahithophel was David's counselor. We spent hours together. We walked to the house of God in company. We spent hours together. We went up to the temple together. We talked. We visited. What was it? You see, hurt. People hold on. Is it understandable why Absalom was hurt and deeply wounded? Is it understandable why Ahithophel was hurt and deeply wounded? You bet it is. You could go through the Bible and you could look at example after example. It's not a matter that the source of the hurt can't be understood. It's not a matter that some of the hurts that you and I have that we've held on to don't have a source in terms of some terrible thing that happened, something someone did, some abuse that was suffered, some terrible thing. There are all sorts of things that have happened, horrible things. It's not a matter of diminishing those hurts and saying, well, it's no big deal. Was what happened involving Tamar and Absalom, was it a big deal? You bet it was. Was what happened involving Bathsheba and Ahithophel's family, was it a big deal? You bet it was. But you go on through the story. Look at how Absalom's life ended. A rebel, a failure, hanging there suspended from a tree, stuck through with a spear. Ahithophel, when he realized the whole thing collapsed, he went home and committed suicide. Everything had collapsed. A dejected, depressed, embittered individual. Is it understandable why he felt that way? Yes, it is. But it doesn't matter how understandable it is. If you hold on to it, it enslaves you. Absalom and Ahithophel died slaves. Slaves to the hurt and the bitterness that controlled their lives. The issue is not whether or not the hurt was real. The issue is what was done. Covetousness enslaves, pride enslaves, hurt leading into resentment and bitterness enslaves. You know, fear can enslave. You go through the life of Saul and you read the story of a man who was enslaved by his fears. Saul was not a man that possessed naturally a lot of confidence. You remember the story when Saul was going to be introduced as king, when he was first chosen as king? Got ready to announce Saul. You know, he come up here, Saul the son of Kish, new king. Waited, and nobody came. After a while, people started looking around. Nobody saw him, you know. Where is he? Finally, they went and found him. He was hiding. He gotten back in the storeroom. He was hiding. He was so embarrassed and so, you know, just the sense of inadequacy that he, when the time came for him to come up and get up in front of everybody, he just petrified him. Well, I think a lot of us can understand being overwhelmed, feeling inadequate. You know, a lot of God's servants whom God has called felt inadequate. Because the reality is that every one of us are inadequate. Every one of us is inadequate. There's none of us that can measure up and on our own become what God has called us to be. You know, Moses felt inadequate. He said, well, I don't speak well, and I got this problem, that problem. People aren't going to listen. They're not going to believe me. Jeremiah said, I'm too young. I'm sure somebody said, I'm too old. You know, Isaiah said, no, you don't want me. I'm a man of unclean lips. I mean, go through the Bible. It includes, you read excuses over and over. People said, oh, I can't do that. I'm not good enough. I can't measure up. I can't do that. I'm going to tell you something. God's not impressed with excuses. Find me one example in the Bible where somebody gave an excuse to God and He said, boy, you know, I never thought of that. My, that's a good excuse. You're right. I can't use you. Show me the place in the Bible where God was impressed with somebody's excuses. I don't know of any. You see, God's not into excuses. He's into solutions. Saul was a man who felt inadequate. He was intimidated by the job. That's not bad, because if he really understood what he was had the opportunity of doing, he should have felt intimidated and overwhelmed. But you see, the answer when you feel intimidated and overwhelmed is to go to the one who, as Paul says, my God shall supply all your needs according to His riches and glory. See, there is a source. There's one who is never inadequate, who's never overwhelmed. You think God is overwhelmed? He's sitting there sort of rubbing his hands saying, I don't know, boy, I don't see how I'm going to do this. We're at the Red Sea. I don't know how I'm going to get them across. Don't have time to build a bridge. The great God, the one who created everything in 6 days, what's God intimidated by? But you see, we get intimidated because we start looking at us and quit looking at God. Saul, as you go on through the story, Saul never got past his fear. Later on, you read the account. Saul wanted to be popular. He wanted to be accepted. He wanted people's approval. He was given instructions by God through Samuel. In one case, he was to go out and defeat the Philistines, but Samuel said, now wait till I come. I'll come and then you go. Well, Samuel was running a little late. He wasn't the last minister to run a little late, but he was running a little late. And Saul was pacing the floor, and Saul was getting nervous because, you see, the army was trickling off. Every time you get up in the morning, there were less. There were, wait a minute, I thought we had tents over there. Well, looks like somebody snuck off during the night. Because, you see, they didn't want to go down there and face the Philistines. And so Saul's army was evaporating right before his eyes, and he was scared. So he decided, instead of waiting for Samuel, he'd just go ahead and offer the sacrifice himself. Well, sure enough, just about the time he got finished, Samuel showed up. And, you see, Saul was afraid. That's why he did it. His fear led him into compromise. Fear leads us into compromise. It leads us away from faith. Fear leads us into self-protective strategies, trying to protect and preserve the self because we're afraid. Saul wanted to protect himself. You go on through the story a little later, God sent him out to defeat the Amalekites, to destroy the Amalekites. And Samuel told him, he said, now look, when you go out after the Amalekites, I want you to destroy everything. I don't want you taking any of the booty. Don't be taking the animals. Don't take any of the treasures. I'm not sending you out to go to battle with the Amalekites because I want you to steal all the stuff they have. I am executing my judgment on the Amalekites. Well, Samuel showed up after the battle. Saul came out to meet him and he said, boy, you're going to be proud of me this time. I followed instructions to the T. I did everything you told me. And Samuel said, well, what's all this lowing of oxen and bleating of sheep that I hear? Where did all this stuff come from? Oh, that. Oh, well, now, the people. The people wanted to keep the best of it. And you know, they were going to offer it as a sacrifice to God. Samuel went through and pressed him, and finally Saul admitted. He said, I was afraid. I was afraid. The people wanted this, and I got intimidated because the people wanted to do it, and so I buckled. Fear leads us into compromise. Fear leads us into trying to protect the self. Saul wanted to be popular. He wanted to be king. Later on, when Goliath was taunting the Israelites, nobody went out to battle. Nobody went out to battle. Days went by. 40 days went by. Almost 6 weeks. David showed up from home. He was still in his teens. And had shown up bringing some food for his older brothers from home. Got there just in time to hear Goliath come out and challenge the Israelites. And David said, who is that guy? Who is that uncircumcised Philistine that he would challenge the armies of the living God? Who does this guy think he is? Well, you know the story. You come on through. David was brought before Saul. And they finally said, well, you know, we got one guy who's going to go out. David went out. Goliath was slain. The battle that ensued, the Philistines were roundly defeated. Needless to say, who was the hero of the moment in ancient Israel? David was. Now, in the aftermath of this, Saul, in the victory celebration, overheard a chorus, a women's chorus, singing a refrain. Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. And boy, did that ever get to Saul. He now was afraid that David was going to take the kingship. As you go through and read the story, you read the story of how a man literally unraveled mentally and emotionally. Because he was obsessed by his fear. You see, in his mind, David was the cause of all his problems. If he could get rid of David, everything would be okay. How many times have people gone through something and said, you know, if it weren't for so-and-so, if it weren't for this, if it weren't for that, everything would be okay. We view other people, other circumstances, other situations. We view that as our problem. Well, my problem is this or that. Brethren, if you want to see your problem, look in the mirror. Saul was Saul's problem. I am my problem. You are your problem. There's only one person on the face of this earth that any of us can change. That's us. You need God's help to do that. Saul was overwhelmed and led into all sorts of things trying to protect himself. Saul's fears ultimately became realized. The very things of which he was afraid ultimately came to pass. You see, our fears take us into compromise, into self-protective strategies. You can go back, you can read other stories. Remember Jeroboam, the first king over Israel after the kingdom split, after Solomon's death? Jeroboam began to worry. He worried that, you know, once the emotions settle, things aren't different then than they are now. You know, people get all whipped up and there's a lot of emotion, and then things go by and life sort of settles out a little bit. Jeroboam began to worry. And his worry was that the people going down to Judah, going to Jerusalem every year for the Feast of Tabernacles and the Passover, that after a few years went by, they would become nostalgic for the good old days when they were all together. By that time, they'd be upset at him about some decision he had made. And the next thing he knew, he wouldn't be king anymore. They would have all joined together and reunited the kingdom, and he'd be out of a job. Now, he worried about that, and he was afraid that that was happening. And the more he thought about it and stewed about it and analyzed it, it made sense on a human carnal level. The problem was, all fears make sense when you leave God out of the picture. But fears don't make sense when God is in the picture. It made sense to be scared of Goliath if there isn't a God. It made sense for Jeroboam to worry about what was going to happen if there isn't a God. But if there's a God, then you see, God is bigger than whatever it is we're afraid of. You read the story, and ultimately Jeroboam brought about the destruction of his dynasty and his nation. Every other king of Israel that is ever mentioned, it always says, and he walked in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. Well, what a distinction. You set things on the wrong track and nobody ever got it right again. And you get the credit. Ultimately, fear led Jeroboam into trying to protect himself. And the very things he sought to protect were destroyed. Covetousness, pride, hurt, fear. These are the sources that enslave us, that lead us into every imaginable specific thing. You know, we can seek to retaliate. We're going to get back at somebody. We're going to hurt them like they hurt us. We're going to protect ourselves. So many things that come in as reasonings in our mind, enslaved and ensnared. Now, all of these things are the sources of sin. And those sources of sin make us in need of God's deliverance. They make us in need of what you and I cannot provide for ourselves. Just as Israel was unable to extricate themselves from Egyptian bondage, you and I, on our own strength and our own power, it's not a matter of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. You and I cannot rescue ourselves. We cannot deliver ourselves from the covetousness, the pride, the hurt, the fear that has dominated the human race. You know, if you go all the way back to Genesis 3 and 4, you find the covetousness, the pride, the hurt, the fear. You find what happened as basically covetousness and pride, what Satan appealed to entice Eve. She saw that it was pleasant to the eyes and it was good for food. She coveted what God said not to have. It appealed to the pride of life. It was a tree to be desired to make one wise. You come on into Genesis 4 and you read about Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel both offered sacrifices to God, but Abel's sacrifice was accepted and Cain's wasn't. And Cain, we're told, became upset in the aftermath of that. I think it would be fair to say that Cain had his feelings hurt. He resented what happened. God told Cain, gave Cain a short sermon on overcoming. He said, Cain, if you do well, won't you be accepted too? You'll be accepted just like Abel if you do well. Cain, sin lies at the door. Sin lies at the door, and its desire is to pull you down. But you've got to master it. You've got to overcome it. Cain didn't do that. Cain nursed his hurt and his resentment. He blamed Abel for getting him in trouble. You made me look bad. A little later, he killed his brother. Nursed a resentment, bitterness. You know, in Cain's case, the hurt was not justified. He should have taken the correction and changed. In some cases, maybe in the case of Absalom or Ahithophel, you can say, well, the hurt was, quote, justified. The point is whether it was legitimate or not. When we hold on to our hurts and our grievances, they develop into resentments. they develop into bitterness. And they lead to destructive, terrible things. Fear? What did Adam and Eve do? They hid themselves. They isolated themselves from God. They were afraid. You know, what they should have done was gone looking for God, because He was the only one who could get them out. But the tendency of human beings is, you know, sometimes because of pride, because of hurt, because of whatever it is, our fears come into play. So where's Adam? You know, well, he's hiding behind the bushes. Finally comes out and he's got this silly little fig leaf apron on. God says, Adam, you didn't by chance take of the tree I told you to leave alone, did you? Oh, no. Whatever make you think a thing like that? Well, actually it was the woman. The one you gave me. She actually is the one that did it. I just sort of took a little bite. I told you I was going to answer 2 questions. What I didn't tell you is I'm going to answer 2 questions on 2 days. Because we have looked at the sources of sin. The things that entangle us, ensnare us, and leave us slaves. I want, on the last day of this festival period, to focus in on 7 essential qualities necessary to be an overcomer. How is it? You know, slaves don't want to stay slaves. Israel didn't want to stay in the situation they were. They wanted deliverance. But, you know, most of that generation that was delivered, at least the adult portion of the group that came out, never lived to enter the promised land. They never fully received the deliverance God had. There are many people who have been entrapped and entangled and ensnared and enslaved by the sources of sin, have wanted deliverance, but have somehow never been able to follow Jesus Christ out of slavery and into freedom. What is necessary to make that journey, to successfully complete that journey? Because that's what being an overcomer is all about. Well, I want to focus our attention on that and be thinking about it during these days. It's a good theme to meditate on. And I want to focus our attention on that. Let's conclude back here in Romans chapter 8. Romans chapter 8. God's intention and God's purpose for all of us is deliverance. And there is nothing from which God can't deliver you and me, if we are willing to follow where He leads. We're told in Romans chapter 8, verse 20, the creation was made subject to vanity, subject to being temporary, futile, not willingly, but by reason of Him who subjected the same in hope. Because the creation itself also shall be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. God knows how to deliver. What you and I have to learn is how to follow. Because God knows how to deliver, and if you and I will follow, we will be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. On the last holy day, I want to focus our attention on how to successfully complete the journey out of slavery into deliverance.